Welcome to Creepy Whispers. I'm Jack Thompson, and here we'll explore stories that will send chills down your spine. Get ready to dive into the unknown, where each whisper hides a secret. First story, to this day, months later, I still can't explain what happened in that cabin in the Black Forest. The experience I had with my friends that weekend haunts me every night. It was supposed to be just a hiking trip, you know. Hans, Greta, Klaus, and I decided to rent an isolated cabin, the kind you can only reach after driving miles on a dirt road. The idea was to escape the city routine, do some hiking, and relax. Little did we know we were about to live through the biggest nightmare of our lives. We arrived at the location on a Friday afternoon. At first glance, everything seemed normal. The cabin was rustic, all wood, with small windows and a porch that opened directly onto the dense forest. The caretaker, a very old man of few words, just handed us the keys and disappeared without further explanation. Initially, we were excited exploring the place and planning the trails for the next day. I remember Greta mentioning some legends of the region. She commented that the Black Forest was famous for its dark fairy tales. At the time, we joked about it. We said in jest that we'd have to be careful not to run into the witch with the candy house or the big bad wolf. If only we had known those jokes would become something so real and terrifying. When night fell, we decided to make a bonfire outside to roast some marshmallows. That's when things started to get strange. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted. It was unusually cold for that time of year. And then we started hearing sounds coming from the forest. At first, we thought they were just animals, but gradually the noises became, how can I say it, more human, except they weren't normal voices. They sounded more like distorted moans or laments. Initially, we tried to ignore those strange sounds. Hans suggested it was just the wind or some nocturnal animal. But as time passed, it became increasingly difficult to believe that. The noises seemed to be getting closer, and with them came a feeling of discomfort that I can't quite explain. It was as if something was watching us from the shadows of the forest. Klaus, always the bravest of the group, decided to take a look around the cabin with a flashlight. I remember seeing his beam of light cutting through the darkness as he walked along the edge of the clearing. Suddenly, he screamed and came running back. He said he had seen something moving between the trees, something that didn't look like a common animal. At that moment, we decided it was better to go inside the cabin and lock everything up. The atmosphere became tense. Nobody could relax. Greta tried to call someone outside, but there was no cell signal there. We sat in the living room, trying to calm down and rationalize what was happening. That's when we noticed something even stranger. The cabin's clocks had stopped. They all showed exactly midnight. We thought the batteries had run out or something, but when I looked at my cell phone, it also showed midnight. And no matter how much time seemed to pass, the clock didn't move. That's when we began to realize that something truly out of the ordinary was happening. The feeling that time had stopped was frightening. We sat there in the cabin's living room, looking at each other without knowing what to say or do. The silence inside the house was broken only by the strange sounds coming from the forest, which seemed to be getting louder and closer. Suddenly, we heard knocks on the door. They weren't normal knocks. They were as if someone or something was scratching the wood. No one had the courage to open it. Hans suggested we go upstairs, thinking it would be safer. We climbed the creaky stairs, huddling in the small attic room. The windows were tiny. We could barely see anything outside beyond the darkness of the forest. That's when the light started to flicker. It wasn't like a normal electrical failure. It was a strange pattern, almost as if someone was playing with the switch. And with each flicker, I swore I saw shadows moving in the corners of the room. Greta started crying softly, Klaus tried to appear calm, but you could see he was terrified too. I felt my heart beating so hard I thought it was going to explode. The worst part was the feeling of helplessness, of not knowing what to do, of being trapped in that place with something we couldn't understand outside. And time kept standing still, the clock still showing midnight, as if we were trapped in an endless nightmare. I can't say how long we stayed in that attic. It could have been minutes or hours. It was impossible to be sure. At some point, the light stopped flickering and we were in total darkness. The silence that followed was almost deafening. No one dared to speak or move. It was as if the very air around us had become heavy, difficult to breathe. Suddenly, we heard footsteps coming from downstairs. Slow, dragging footsteps climbing the stairs. My whole body froze. I looked at my friends, and even in the darkness, I could see the terror in their eyes. The footsteps were getting closer and closer to the attic. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, we started hearing voices. They weren't normal voices. They were like distorted whispers, speaking in a language we couldn't understand. The sound seemed to come from all sides at once, as if it was inside our heads. Klaus, in an act of desperation or courage, grabbed his flashlight and turned it on. What we saw at that moment makes me doubt my own sanity to this day. The attic walls were covered with strange symbols, which seemed to have been written with some kind of dark liquid. They glowed supernaturally in the flashlight's beam. And there, standing in the attic doorway, was a shadowy figure, almost human, but different. Before we could do anything, the figure moved towards us with impossible speed. The moment the figure moved, Klaus dropped the flashlight. We were again in total darkness, hearing only our heavy breathing and the sound of something moving around the room. Greta let out a muffled scream, and I felt someone or something brush against my arm. Panic took over all of us. We got up blindly, stumbling over each other, trying to find the way out of the attic. Hans managed to find the door first, and we ran down the stairs, not looking back. I can't explain how, but when we got downstairs, the lights were on and everything seemed normal. We looked at each other, confused and scared. There was no sign of the figure we had seen, nor of the symbols on the walls. We stood there, trying to understand what had happened. That's when I noticed something strange. The wall clock was working again, but it showed exactly the same time it had when we arrived at the cabin the day before. I looked out the window and saw that the sky was brightening, as if the sun was rising. But it was impossible. We had been awake all night, hadn't we? Klaus was the first to have the courage to open the front door. Outside, everything looked exactly as it had when we arrived. The car parked, our backpacks on the porch, the caretaker coming towards us to hand over the keys. It was as if we had gone back in time to the moment we arrived at the cabin. We all stood paralyzed, looking at each other without knowing what to say or do. The caretaker approached with the same vacant look as before and handed us the keys as if nothing had happened. I tried to say something, to ask if he had seen or heard anything strange during the night, but the words simply wouldn't come out. Greta was the first to react. She grabbed her backpack and said we needed to leave immediately. No one disagreed. Quickly, we gathered our things and headed for the car, ignoring the caretaker's confused protests about the cabin rental. As Hans started the car, I couldn't stop looking back at the cabin that seemed so normal and harmless in the daylight. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the attic window, for a split second, I saw a shadow moving. I blinked and it was gone, but I'm sure of what I saw. No one said anything during the trip back. We were all in shock, trying to process what had happened. Every now and then, one of us would look at the car clock, as if to confirm that time was really passing. The feeling of relief only came when we finally left the dirt road and returned to the main highway. In the weeks that followed, we tried to find explanations for what happened that night. We researched the history of the region, looked for similar reports, even considered the possibility that we had been victims of some kind of collective hallucination, but nothing made sense. The strangest thing was that when we tried to talk about what happened with other people, the words just wouldn't come out right. It was as if something was preventing us from fully sharing that experience. Gradually, each of us dealt with it in a different way. Klaus refused to talk about it, as if he wanted to erase that night from his memory. Greta became obsessed with finding a logical explanation, spending hours researching theories about paranormal phenomena. Hans and I were the only ones who still talked openly about what we experienced. We compared our memories, trying to find some detail that might have gone unnoticed. It was during one of these conversations that we noticed something disturbing. Our memories of the night were not exactly the same. There were small differences in the details, as if each of us had experienced a slightly different version of the events. This only increased our confusion and the feeling that something truly inexplicable had happened in that cabin. Even now, months later, I still wake up in the middle of the night sometimes, with the feeling of being back in that dark attic, hearing those incomprehensible whispers. The impact of that night on our daily lives was deeper than we imagined. I began to notice subtle changes in my day-to-day life. Sometimes I had the impression that time was slowing down around me, especially at midnight. I started avoiding looking at clocks at that time, fearing to see the hands stop again. Hans told me he developed an aversion to forests and could no longer sleep in the dark. Greta, on the other hand, became obsessed with ancient symbols and began studying dead languages, as if it could help her decipher what we saw that night. The strangest thing of all is that, about a month after the incident, we received a letter. It was from the cabin caretaker. In it, he apologized for the inconvenience and offered us a free stay as compensation. What really disturbed me was the postscript of the letter. It simply said, "The doors of the forest will always be open for you. I can't explain why, but those words sent a chill down my spine." We decided not to respond and never talk about that place again. But the truth is, deep down, we all knew that experience had marked us in a way that we would never be able to forget or truly understand. Today, almost a year after that night, I still find myself thinking about what really happened. Sometimes when I'm alone, I have the feeling that I'm being watched, as if something from that forest had followed me. We never got together, the four of us, since that day. It's as if that experience had created an invisible barrier between us. We tried to resume our normal lives, but something changed fundamentally. There are days when I wake up, and for a moment, I'm not sure if time has really passed or if I'm still trapped in that endless night in the cabin. The scariest thing is that recently, I saw a news report about mysterious disappearances in the Black Forest region. The descriptions of the events that preceded the disappearances were strangely familiar. Reports of distorted time, inexplicable sounds, sensations of being watched. I can't help but think that somehow we escaped from something much bigger and older than we could imagine. Sometimes I wonder if we'll ever have answers, or if this mystery will forever be kept in the shadows of that forest. All I know is that I will never be the same after that night, and that part of me is still there, trapped in an eternal loop, waiting to understand what really happened. Second story. 6 months ago, my life took an unexpected turn. My wife, our 2 children, and I were exhausted from the hectic city life. The constant noise, chaotic traffic, and work pressure had reached their limits. That's when we decided to leave everything behind and start anew in a completely different place. We found what seemed to be the perfect refuge, an isolated cabin in northern Canada, surrounded by dense forests and overlooking a crystal clear lake. The promise of peace and reconnection with nature was irresistible. Little did we know we were about to plunge into an experience that would challenge everything we believed to be real. The journey to the cabin was long and tiring. We arrived on a late autumn afternoon, with the sky painted in shades of gray and the cold air cutting our faces. At first glance, the place was exactly as in the photos, a rustic wooden structure, cozy and charming, nestled among tall pine trees that seemed to touch the clouds. As we unloaded the luggage from the car, I felt a chill run down my spine. At the time, I attributed it to the sudden drop in temperature, but today I understand it was a harbinger of what was to come. That night, exhausted, we slept deeply. It was only when I woke up the next morning that I began to notice something was different. The silence that enveloped us wasn't as comforting as we had expected. It was dense, almost palpable, as if the air itself was laden with secrets. In the first few days, I tried to ignore that strange feeling. After all, it was natural to feel a bit uncomfortable when moving to such an isolated place, right? We focused on adapting to the new routine, exploring the surroundings, arranging the house, discovering the charms of life in the midst of nature. But as the days went by, inexplicable events began to happen. First, it was the noises. Muffled sounds coming from the basement, as if someone was dragging heavy furniture. The problem was, we didn't have a basement. When we checked, there was nothing down there but packed earth and some old boards. My wife said it was just the normal sounds of an old house settling, but I couldn't convince myself of that. Things started to get really scary on the fifth night. We were all sitting in the living room, enjoying the warmth of the fireplace, when we heard a shrill scream coming from outside. It wasn't an animal, I'm sure of that. It was a human scream, full of anguish and despair. I ran to the window, but outside there was only darkness. No movement, no light, just the dense and silent forest staring back at us. My children started crying, frightened, and my wife tried to calm them down, saying it was probably just the wind. But I knew in the pit of my stomach that it wasn't the wind. That night, nobody slept well. We all huddled in the living room, with the lights on, waiting for dawn as if our lives depended on it. The next morning, we decided to investigate the surroundings of the cabin. Maybe we'd find some rational explanation for the scream from the night before. It was during this exploration that we made a disturbing discovery. About 100 meters from the house, in a small clearing, we found several stones arranged in concentric circles. In the center, there was a larger stone with strange symbols carved into it. I didn't recognize any of them, but they had an ancient and mysterious aspect. My oldest daughter, 12, was the first to notice something even more unsettling. Scattered around the stones were small bones. Some seemed to be from animals, but others, well, I preferred not to think too much about it. A chill ran down my spine when I realized that this could be an ancient site of indigenous rituals. That night, things got drastically worse. Around 3 a.m, we woke up to the sound of drums. It was a constant hypnotic rhythm that seemed to come from all directions at once. I jumped up, my heart racing. My wife grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with fear. The children came running to our room, crying. The sound was getting louder and louder, as if it was approaching the house. I looked out the window and almost screamed in fright. There were dozens of flickering lights among the trees, moving towards us. They weren't lanterns or torches. They were like small floating balls of fire. I locked all the doors and windows, gathering my family in the living room. The sound of the drums was deafening now, making the walls of the cabin vibrate. And then, as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The silence that followed was even more frightening. The next morning, no one had the courage to leave the cabin. We spent the whole day locked in, curtains closed, trying to find a logical explanation for what had happened. My wife suggested it could have been a party from some local community we didn't know about, but I knew it wasn't that. Those sounds, those lights, they were something completely out of the ordinary. The children were terrified, begging to leave. I wanted to agree with them, pack our bags and leave immediately, but something told me it wouldn't be that simple. It was as if the forest around us had taken on a life of its own, watching us, keeping us trapped there. It was on the third day after the incident that things got even stranger. I woke up in the middle of the night with the feeling that someone was watching me. I opened my eyes and almost screamed. There was a shadowy figure standing at the foot of our bed. It was tall, with undefined contours, as if made of dark smoke. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or make any sound. The figure stood there for a few seconds that seemed like an eternity, and then simply disappeared, as if it had been absorbed by the shadows of the room. I shook my wife to wake her up, but when I turned on the light, there was no sign of intrusion. The doors were still locked, the windows closed. Was I going crazy? Or was there something in that land, something ancient and powerful, that was trying to communicate with us? The days that followed were a waking nightmare. Objects began to move on their own around the house. At first, it was small things. A glass sliding across the table, a book falling from the shelf without anyone touching it. Then the events became more intense. One night, all the furniture in the living room was stacked in the center of the room, forming a bizarre tower that almost touched the ceiling. Nobody heard anything during the night. It was as if silent ghosts had invaded our house. The children refused to be alone, and my wife started talking about calling a priest or shaman to cleanse the house. I, who had always been skeptical about these things, found myself questioning everything I believed in. The last straw came when my youngest daughter, only 8 years old, started talking to someone invisible. She said it was a special friend who appeared in her room at night. She described him as a tall man, dressed in fur and feathers, with paintings on his face. The scariest thing was that she knew details about local history that we had never mentioned. She talked about ancient wars, sacred rituals, and a great massacre that had happened exactly where our cabin was. When I asked how she knew these things, she simply replied, "The chief told me. He says we're on their land and we need to leave." At that moment, I felt as if a bucket of ice water had been thrown over me. There was no more denying it. We were dealing with something supernatural, something that was beyond our comprehension. That same night, I made the decision that we needed to leave. It didn't matter how much we had invested in this dream of living in isolation. My family's safety came first. I started packing frantically while my wife tried to calm the children. That's when we heard a deafening noise coming from outside, as if hundreds of trees were being felled at once. I ran to the window, and what I saw left me breathless. A dense fog had appeared out of nowhere, completely enveloping the cabin. You couldn't see anything beyond a few meters ahead. The sound of falling trees continued, getting closer and closer. Panic took over all of us. I tried to start the car, but it wouldn't start at all. We were trapped. We spent the whole night awake, huddled in the center of the living room, listening to the terrifying sounds coming from outside. It was as if the entire forest was moving, surrounding us. The walls of the cabin were shaking, and I was sure that at any moment, something would burst through the door. But then, just as it had started, everything stopped. The sudden silence was almost as frightening as the previous chaos. Slowly, I saw the darkness of the night give way to the light of dawn. The fog began to dissipate, and to our surprise, the world outside looked normal. The trees were all in place. There were no signs of destruction. We didn't wait a minute longer. We threw our things in the car, which miraculously started on the first try, and left there as fast as we could. As we drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror and had the impression of seeing a solitary figure standing in front of the cabin, watching our departure. I blinked my eyes and it was gone. To this day, I can't explain what happened during those days. Sometimes I wonder if it was all a product of our imagination, the stress of such a radical change. But then I remember the details, the sounds, the sensations, and I know it was real. Whatever inhabits that land, we left behind. But the memories, those unfortunately came with us. Third story, I never imagined a simple summer trip could turn into something so terrifying. It all began when my brother and I inherited a cabin by a lake in Finland. At first, we were thrilled about spending our vacation there. We'd always dreamed of having a place like this, away from the hustle and bustle of the city, where we could relax and enjoy nature. When we arrived, the place seemed like paradise. The cabin was rustic but cozy, and the lake. That lake was breathtaking. The water was so calm and crystal clear that you could see the perfect reflection of the trees and sky. I remember thinking this would be the perfect summer, away from everything and everyone, just my brother and I enjoying the peace and tranquility of this incredible place. For the first few days, everything went as planned. We'd wake up early, have coffee on the porch overlooking the lake, then go fishing or swimming. The nights were peaceful. We'd make a bonfire, roast marshmallows, and tell silly stories. But it was on one of those nights that things started to get strange. We were sitting by the fire when we heard a noise coming from the lake. At first, I thought it was just a fish jumping, but the sound was different, deeper, as if it came from the depths of the water. My brother and I looked at each other, trying to hide our discomfort. I tried to convince myself it was just our imagination playing tricks on us. After all, we were in the middle of nowhere. It was normal to feel a bit scared. But that strange feeling wouldn't go away. It was as if something was watching us from the depths of the lake. The next morning, I woke up with an odd sensation. The lake, which had seemed so inviting before, now had an eerie air about it. As we had coffee, I mentioned the noise from the previous night to my brother. He tried to downplay it, saying it was probably just some wild animal, but I could tell he was uneasy too. We decided to take a walk along the lake shore to see if we could find a logical explanation. As we walked, I noticed something strange in the water. They weren't normal ripples caused by the wind. They were like movements, as if something large was moving just below the surface. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but the more I looked, the more certain I became that there was something there. My brother noticed it too. We stood still, watching in silence, until we saw a huge shadow pass quickly under the water. It wasn't a common fish. It was something much larger. My heart raced, and I felt a chill in my stomach. I looked at my brother and saw the same fear in his eyes. Without a word, we slowly began to retreat towards the cabin. That's when we heard the deep, guttural sound coming from the lake again. This time, it was closer, louder, as if the creature knew we had seen it and was warning us. Back at the cabin, we tried to rationalize what we had seen. Maybe it was just a very large fish, or perhaps a group of fish swimming together. But deep down, we knew it was something different, something that shouldn't be there. We spent the rest of the day restless, alternating between moments of denial and fear. At night, we couldn't sleep. We were alert to every noise, every movement outside the cabin. Around midnight, we heard the sound of water moving violently, as if something huge had emerged from the lake. Then a dull thud, as if that same thing had hit the shore. With our hearts in our mouths, we approached the window. The full moon illuminated the lake, but the shore was partially covered in shadows. That's when we saw it. a huge, misshapen silhouette moving along the lakeshore. It wasn't an animal we knew. It had an elongated, almost serpentine body, but with appendages that looked like arms or tentacles. It moved strangely, as if not fully adapted to being out of water. Panic took over us. That thing was less than 50 meters from our cabin, and it seemed to be approaching. We didn't know what to do. Run? Scream for help? But who would hear us in this isolated place? We were paralyzed, watching the creature slowly move towards the cabin. Each step it took made the ground tremble slightly. The fear was so great that I could barely breathe. My brother grabbed my arm so tightly it hurt, but I didn't care. We were completely terrified. Suddenly, the creature stopped. It stood motionless for a few seconds that seemed like an eternity. Then slowly, it turned what appeared to be its head towards our window. We couldn't see its eyes, but we were absolutely certain it was staring at us. At that moment, something inexplicable happened. I felt a strange pressure in my head, as if something or someone was trying to communicate directly with my mind. They weren't exactly words, but sensations, blurred images of a very distant past. I saw the lake, but different, vaster, older. I saw creatures like that one, living in the depths. I saw rituals by the water, people worshiping these creatures as gods. It was as if this thing was showing me its history, its origin. I looked at my brother, and by his dazed look, I realized he was experiencing something similar. This connection lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When the strange sensation passed, the creature was still there, motionless. We remained in absolute silence, hardly daring to breathe. After what seemed like forever, it began to move again, but this time towards the lake. We watched its enormous silhouette slowly slide back into the water, making waves that reached the shore near the cabin. In a few seconds, it had completely disappeared into the depths of the lake, leaving only the agitated surface as evidence of its presence. We spent the rest of the night awake, unable to sleep or even talk about what we had seen. When the sun finally rose, we decided it was time to leave. We no longer felt safe there. We hurriedly packed our things, throwing everything into the car without even bothering to organize. As we were leaving, I took one last look at the lake. The surface was calm, as if nothing had happened. But now I knew those waters hid something I couldn't explain. Something ancient and frightening that, for some reason, had decided to reveal itself to us. 5 years have passed since that night by the lake, and I still can't explain what happened. My brother and I rarely talk about it now, as if we've made a silent agreement to leave that experience in the past. But sometimes when I'm alone, I feel that same strange sensation, as if something is watching me from afar. It's in these moments that I wonder if we really left something behind in that lake, or if we brought something with us. We never went back to the cabin. We tried to sell it, but for some reason, no buyer was interested. It's as if the place had been marked, just like us. The research I did led to no concrete conclusions, only 2 more unanswered questions. The creature was never seen again, at least not that I know of. But on full moon nights, when I look at any body of water, I can't shake the feeling that there's something down there, something ancient and mysterious, patiently waiting. And sometimes, just sometimes, I hear the deep, guttural sound echoing in my mind, like a reminder that there are things in this world that are beyond our understanding.